Oh, hi, hello there. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your Thebes-obsessed host, Liv. Now, today we are back with another conversation, as promised, and it begins with an apology to my guest, Meagan Cleveland, who is joining me to talk all of the study that she has done on Statius's Thebaid. Thebaid? Anyway, it's about Thebes. We recorded this episode back in March of 2022. It has been a very long time, and the reason is that, as you'll hear in the episode, I originally intended to do this whole big series of episodes covering the Thebaid before airing this, so that, you all had the necessary context of the story, because it sounds so good, and Meagan really sold me on it. But then, I looked at the epic and I realized how long it was, and I wasn't sure if you all, my listeners, or I was ready for a multi-part series that long. It would have been longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey because of how detailed I am now, and so I just kept putting it off, and thus kept putting off Meagan's episode. But when I hit this very Rome month of episodes, I realized that we really just need to hear all the things that Meagan has to share about the epic, whether or not we have heard the story itself. And, we will get to the story itself, the epic itself, eventually. But for now, the Thebaid is a Roman epic, but it tells the story of Greek myth, very in the vein of Seneca. It's a very Roman thing to do. And actually, Statius was writing only shortly after Seneca. And based on some of the wild-ass violence that Meagan mentions happening in this epic, I think you can really see the time period that both of these writers, their work and they were working in, it really only adds to the intrigue. When you're living under Nero, shit's gonna go down, And like I said, one day I will make a huge series on this epic, but until then, the basics are this. Think back to my episodes on Sophocles' Oedipus, and then further back to my episodes on Sophocles' Antigone and Euripides' Phoenician women. The epic revolves around the ramifications of Oedipus's family and then the war between the brothers, his sons, over who will take the throne of Thebes. Of course, there's so much more to it because it's a whole ass epic, but that is basically what you need to know, other than what Meagan is going to share. I've also linked to the Wikipedia page for the epic if you wanted to read a bit about it yourself. Honestly, though, even just re-listening to this conversation after so long, it really just made me want to dive back into that work. So hopefully we won't be too far off from that on the podcast. But as I started saying, huge enormous apologies to Meagan for how long this took to air, and equally enormous thanks for her incredible and kind patience. But I'm so glad to finally have it for you all. Unfortunately, we did also have a connection issue when we recorded that meant sometimes our replies to each other were seriously delayed. So if you're thinking Liv usually interjects more than this, that's absolutely why. Because yeah, I normally do. You'll also hear a lot about a novel that Meagan's written about the children of Oedipus and Jocasta, so you'll absolutely hear more from her on the show to talk about that. And we also speak of my own novel, but again, this was recorded a while ago, so I don't want you all getting ideas that I've, gotten any further into it or getting it to be reality, because I haven't. One day, maybe. I kept it all in because I've heard from all of you that you like, hearing about people talking about their writing processes and particularly how frustrating and never-ending it can be. We can all live in our misery together. Because isn't that the truth? Until then, we can always use more Thebes on the podcast, especially one featuring such fascinating and, violent characters. Conversations. When Romans write Greek myth, Statius's Thebaid with Meagan Cleveland. I don't remember exactly what other than just Thebes you told me we were going to talk about, and I was so excited that I just have kept writing Thebes all in caps everywhere that I've planned this.
Yeah.
So tell me, what about Thebes do you study? What about Thebes are we going to talk about? I'm so excited.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Thebaid, which is a Roman epic about
Right.
Thebes.
Sorry.
But like, that's okay. I've been studying Thebes, like, I've been out of grad school for a couple years, but I've been doing like an independent study because I'm writing a book about Thebes. So I've been learning all this stuff. So even if we're talking about this Roman depiction of Thebes, we can still talk about Greek Thebes because I have that background there too. So we're going to talk about this extremely violent, fun epic by Statius.
And so, okay, I have not read his Thebaid, but is it like say the Fall of Troy, the Roman epic that's based on maybe probably an ancient Greek epic that we don't have? So is this one assumed to be like based on, you might be about to tell me this, but it's of course my first question is it assumed to be based on the ancient like Theban cycle that we think existed?
Yeah, so it certainly has some connection to that lost epic, but like other presentations of Thebes that we get from, say, like the Greek playwrights, he puts his own spin on it. So we can't be sure what is like in that lost
Right.
epic and what was Statius's own invention. So we'll just have to see, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a story of lost epic, right? It's like, who knows? But hey, we have it. That's what matters, right?
Yeah. So are you ready to start?
Please dive right in.
Okay, so from when we talked about before, I'm assuming you're going to do a little series on the Thebaid where you read it. So I'm not going to summarize it. I'm just going to go straight in and talk about what I think's interesting about it.
Please.
All right. So the Thebaid is an epic about the war between the sons of Oedipus and about the destruction of Thebes. So when you think about Thebes, you think about the Sphinx. And in the Thebaid, we get this image of the Sphinx as she falls to her death, and she dashes what Statius describes as her album on the rocks. And this image can be equated with the destruction of Thebes. And I'm going to have some Latin in here. I hope you don't mind.
Please.
Okay.
I don't know any Latin, so have at it.
All right, great. So the noun alvus can mean either belly or womb. So the belly of the Sphinx evokes the stomach of the monster that consumed so many Thebans, but it also evokes the womb of Jocasta, which received what it brought forth, which is my fancy way of saying she had sex with her son. So
received what it brought forth. Oh my god, it took me a second.
I had to.
That's so good.
This is kind of like an informal version of something I did in grad school. So that was the grad school version. But like, to break it down, she had sex with her son. So we've got that image of the womb receiving what it put forth, if that makes sense. So he's coming back. I don't know. Let's not think about it too much.
Oh, that makes sense. I love it. It's so good.
So this word alvum, which can mean either belly or womb or both, it acts as this microcosm for the self-destructive state of the Thebaid. The way I think of it is like an Ouroboros. Have you seen one of those? It's that snake that swallows its own tail. So it's like consuming itself. So we're also going to talk about the word consumption today. So Statius communicates this self-destruction through the verb consumo. So consumo can have three different meanings. It can mean to waste, to destroy, or to devour. And there's three characters of the Thebaid that embody these three different meanings of consumo. Adrastus wastes, Polynices destroys, and Titius devours. And each of these figures share in common the stigma of familial violence. So I believe that the stigma of familial violence contributes to that destructive nature of consumption in the epic. The less distance between the character and the act of violence itself, the more the character is associated with destructive consumption. Adrastus is a descendant of Tantalus, and because he's like a distant descendant, that removes him from the stigma of filicide, so he's considered to be one of the few good characters, but he's the responsible for the waste of Argive men in a Theban war. Polynices, the son of Oedipus, is close to the stigma of patricide and incest committed by his father, and he's ultimately responsible for the destruction of Thebes and the end of the line of Oedipus through his war with Eteocles. And Titus, my favorite, he bears the stigma of fratricide, a crime he notably committed himself. There's a line in the epic that says, "Polutes fraternos sanguine Titus," Titus stained with a brother's blood. Of all the characters, Titus represents the most destructive force of consumption by becoming a cannibal in Book 8. So we will get to that today.
Oh, good.
Yeah. You might be interested to know about Titus that he is the father of a well-known character from the Iliad. There's two different ways of pronouncing it, but I say Diomedes. So Odysseus' friend and another favorite of Athena's. Yeah, so before Diomedes was born, Titus was also a favorite of Athena's. So we're also going to think of that when we talk about him too. So did you have any questions?
I've said his name so many times, just yeah, I've said his name so many times just because of like, I guess him being Diomedes' son. But then also I'm like, this is one of the few moments in the past podcast that I'm actually legitimately embarrassed by, so we'll see if I keep it in. But like, when I was reading the Iliad, I was first pronouncing it Tidius, which I hate, and I don't know why I thought of it being that, and then I changed it like midway through because people were laughing at me.
Oh.
It's like one of those things where I'm like, damn, Tidius, you really got me.
This thing with studying Greek and Latin is you're never really sure how to pronounce it because it's not really spoken language anymore, right? So you could be right, I could be wrong, so it doesn't really matter.
I know, one just sounds funnier. And for me, it's only because like I also, when I started reading the Iliad, like Tidius, yeah. Like I started reading the Iliad and it like I read it and I didn't read it beforehand. Like, I mean, I've read the Iliad, but I didn't like read that version beforehand. I just sit down with it in front of me and this microphone and I just go for it. So I'm like guessing all these pronunciations like literally in the split second. And sometimes it causes for some funny things.
I understand. It's quite all right. Okay.
Sorry, I'm also good at tangents.
No, that's okay. I will get sucked in and I will just go off if we do that. So it'll be fun at least. So before we talk about the three characters in more depth, I want to talk quickly about Jupiter, who is the Roman Zeus. So the Thebaid starts with a council of the gods that's gathered by Jupiter, and he declares that he's decided to punish a specific group of mortals. And Statius describes Jupiter's decision to punish them is due to his insatiable appetite for violence, and Jupiter directs this insatiable violence towards the royal houses of Argos and Thebes. So we've got this line that Jupiter says, "Nunc geminis punere domos quis sanguinis auctor, ipsi ego descendo, Perseus autor in Argos, scenditur Ionius fluit hic ab origine Thebes. Now I descend to punish two houses, of which blood I myself am the ancestor. One branches into Argos and the other into Thebes." So it's really interesting that Jupiter is punishing these mortals for these crimes against the gods. And he considers these an offense to him, and to remedy this, he decides to destroy them. But he also acknowledges that he's related to them, and he somehow they've inherited his violence. So again, we've got that sort of Ouroboros. He's punishing them for something that they inherited through him. So that's interesting to me. Yeah. I'd like to suggest Jupiter acquired this mentality from his father Saturn, or Cronus. So Jupiter becomes like Saturn through his need to destroy his own descendants, although not in such a literal form of consumption, because as we know, Saturn tried to eat all of his children. The influence of Saturn... Yeah.
Did he ever?
Oh, he did. I'm thinking of that painting by Goya right now, which is my favorite.
Oh, yeah. Always. Always.
The influence of Saturn can explain the proem, which features fathers who wish harm upon their children. In the proem, Oedipus invokes Tisiphone, who's one of the Furies, to curse his sons. A curse Jupiter hears himself, and it motivates his decision to punish Thebes and Argos. So Jupiter decides to punish Thebes and Argos. That character, Drastus, that I talked about before, he is the king of Argos. And there's a lot of scholarship on the Thebaid that used to emphasize the innocence of Argives, and that there was this widely held belief that Argos was dragged into war by an unjust Jupiter, and that Argos was an innocent city corrupted by civil war. However, there is some research by a scholar named Ruth Parks who argues that Statius places the emphasis on Theban guilt. However, Argos, through their ancestral stigma, becomes complicit in Theban guilt through their support of Polynices. Adrastus, like I mentioned before, is considered to be one of the few good and compassionate characters in the poem. Yet, we get these repeated connections between Adrastus and the monstrous figure of Tantalus. When we first meet Adrastus, he sees Polynices, and he tells Polynices that his connection to Oedipus is impossible to hide, but he argues that Polynices doesn't have to let that become a part of his identity, and he offers Polynices a new identity by removing, I guess, Oedipus as his father and offering himself. So Adrastus lets Polynices marry his daughter Argia. And little fun fact for you is the wedding gift Polynices gives to Argia is a certain necklace that used to belong to Harmonia. And that necklace signifies that their marriage is cursed.
Yeah, I was going to say, that is one cursed necklace. I love it so much. Okay. That leads me to a question. Not the necklace, but I mean, if I wish there was more to talk about with the necklace, because I feel like there's not, but also I'm desperately devoted to it as an idea. But how does Adrastus get this separation from the curse of Tantalus when he is in the generation before? Okay, sorry. I'm trying to phrase my question. I guess where is basically, where does Agamemnon's parents, Atreus and Thyestes, where do they come in? Do they bring the curse back, and Adrastus didn't have the curse, and then are they next in the line, and it's oh, you're fucked again?
When you study mythology, you know that there's no timeline. They're all existing at the same time. It's like a multiverse.
Right, and I obviously I say that literally all the time because my listeners are always asking me these types of questions, but it feels to me like the one kind of line of cursed family members that was pretty static felt like that was the Tantalus to Agamemnon through line. So I'm interested in Adrastus in that way, because it feels to me, which is again super possible, that this whole story then is tacked on later because you have this guy who's not cursed, because it's clearly there is this deeply cursed line that leads all the way to Agamemnon, and then he feels so out of place. It's just really interesting in that way. I love those little moments where you're was this thrown in later, where you were just he's not cursed. Oh, how lucky, he was far enough away from Tantalus, he's not cursed.
Well, you picked up on something that scholars have kind of been arguing about for hundreds of years. There's a bunch of different traditions of how he's related to Tantalus, but the one I'm going to focus on my argument here is that Adrastus is related to Tantalus through the figure of Niobe, which is really interesting. Yeah. So, So the popular tradition is that Adrastus is related to Tantalus, the murder of his own child, through Niobe, who is infamous for her act of hubris concerning her children. So like Adrastus, Niobe wastes lives. She wastes the lives of her children through her pride, just as Adrastus wastes the lives of Argive men through his generosity to Polynices. Adrastus's generosity to Polynices and Titius. Titius is also offered one of Adrastus's daughters as his wife, so they become brothers through marriage. And he is generous to them, and through his generosity, it's an extension of his role as hospes or host, which is a role that Tantalus was playing when he committed his crime of filicide. So Adrastus, in this way, he's presented as a Niobe figure because his hubris is trying to escape that ancestral stigma of his house, a stigma he claims doesn't matter when, in fact, we know it's the motivation of Jupiter's punishment.
It matters.
Oh, yeah.
It always matters, man.
And he tries to use like his own version of reverse psychology. So instead of hiding his connection to Tantalus, he flaunts it. He has pictures of him on his banners. He has a statue of him in the hall of his ancestors, and he has his army call themselves the army of the descendants of Tantalus. So he's really like broadcasting it to everybody to try to, I guess, show like, oh, it's not something to hide, but it's having the opposite effect.
It should be.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Oh, I love that.
Yeah, and through this weird way of trying to escape his ancestral stigma by flaunting it, so he's trying to change his fate. So he becomes like Oedipus too, because he's trying and failing to escape that fate that's been placed on him, which is that connection to Tantalus, which is the reason that him and his family are going to be he doesn't get destroyed. He's actually the only character of the 7 that actually lives. The rest of them all die. But his family's ruined forever after this.
Yeah. Because you're a descendant of Tantalus. Like, sorry.
Mm-hmm. So we got to keep in mind all these connections to ancestors, because if we still have time, I want to talk about the historical context in which this is written. So it might have some significance later. So the next character that I was going to talk about is Polynices. Polynices, as we know, is a product of incest. In the epic, he's in exile, denied his birthright, and wandering Greece. He's given the opportunity to change his fate. Through his marriage to Argia, Adrastus gives Polynices the gift of another father, another kingdom, and a new brother in Titius. Yet Polynices' desire to take vengeance on Eteocles and to regain his rightful throne consumes him and destroys any happiness for both himself and everyone around him. So, like I said before, Jupiter is transmitting his insatiable violence to his Theban and Argive descendants, and there's a dominant belief that the Thebans are more subject to this mentality than the Argives, because the Furies have come out of the underworld and they're kind of like acting like the puppet masters and controlling the actions of Eteocles and Polynices. Polynices' desire for it is really cool. When you read it, you're really going to like it because there's a lot of snake imagery that you might want to have some influence in with your book on Cadmus. So there's lots of snakes involved. So Polynices...
I'm excited.
It's a really great book. I'm excited for when you do an episode about it. So Polynices' desire for power destroys the lives of everyone around him. Polynices only realizes the destructive force of his desire for power when Titius dies. When he learns of his friend's death, Polynices has that cinematic moment where he screams to the sky and he says, Nil opus arma auto temptere et perdere mortes, ite precor quidiam dabitus mihi denique maius tidia consumsi. There's no need to prove arms any further and to waste any more deaths. Go, I beg you. What else can you give me? I've destroyed Titius. So there's this scholar named Neil Coffey who's researched a lot of this is based on. He points out that Polynices only rejects the consumption of lives in response to the death of its most avid consumer. He argues that Statius draws together these two different forms of consumo. So Polynices destroys and Titius devours. And by contrasting these, so we contrast Polynices' use of violence to that of his friends. So Polynices' use of violence, it's just kind of selfish. He doesn't realize he's doing it. He's so focused on getting what he wants, he doesn't really notice the casualties that are happening because of him. Whereas Titius is a bit more, he knows what he's doing. That's what I'm going to say about that. He has a certain appetite and pleasure in violence that Polynices doesn't. And even though after Titius dies and he's realized that he's wasted all these lives, you think in this moment Polynices will have a change of heart and maybe he'll be like, oh, you know what, Adrastus, maybe I will go back to Argos and become king like you suggested and just focus on my new family. But no, he wants to go to Thebes. He wants to destroy it because they don't accept him, and he wants to kill his brother. So despite the lessons he learns along the way, Polynices is still focused on killing his brother and destroying Thebes.
I love family curses and family mistakes. I mean, God, Thebes.
And there's
Thebes
so much
and Argos,
of it.
they're both so cursed.
Yeah, they're all cursed in Greece, aren't they, in some way? Ancient Greece, I should say, not modern Greece. So, now I'm going to talk about Titius, which is a very interesting guy. So if there's ever a character that's associated with the word consumo, it's Titius, who literally consumes his enemy. There's a number of arguments concerning what motivates Titius to perform his act of cannibalism in Book 8. There's a scholar named Herscoius who wrote in Patterns of Madness in Statius' Thebaid that Titius is driven by an excess of madness, which was held in check by that figure of Athena. But as Titius lays dying, Athena steps away to go ask Jupiter's permission to grant Titius immortality because she thinks he deserves to become a god. But when she steps away, that madness consumes him and he's driven to commit this terrible act. And when she comes back to tell him the good news, she kind of has this moment where she's like, oh, and she has to like cover her eyes and walk away, and she doesn't offer him immortality because she's so disgusted by what he did.
Ooh.
There's another scholar, Gervais, who was the professor who taught me the Thebaid at grad school. He has an article called Titius the Hero, which argues that epic heroism can't function in the Thebaid, and instead of being modeled on epic heroes, Titius is more often modeled on the monsters that heroes vanquish. And Titius's cannibalism results from a breakdown between those two identities.
That's really interesting.
I know I'm listing a lot of things, but it's just what it's like to study epic is you've got hundreds of years of people's opinions and you have to go through them and decide, well, what do I think based on what these people think, right? So there was some research done by these two people named Brond and Gilbert who discuss how epic similes reflect the era of epic warriors, and they argue that Titius represents the negative manifestation of era, an emotion which usually benefits heroes in epic. So era means wrath, and we know from the Iliad that this is the motivating force that drives Achilles, because it opens saying goddess of the wrath of Achilles. So usually wrath is this sort of positive force because it drives the heroes to achieve their goals. But here, Titius, he doesn't have he's immoderate in his wrath, so he can't control it, and it just kind of drives him insane, and he goes out of hand, and not like the other heroes. So it's like that moment where Achilles desecrates Hector's body, but times 10. He's just letting it get away with him.
That's the thing. Yeah, no, it's just the thing about like the Iliad starting with like saying of the wrath of Achilles is like, as much as Achilles is a hero, I think that's what makes the Iliad so interesting, is that it really is all about like him being over the top, and it being like yeah, this is a story of like so-called heroes, but also the whole thing revolves around the fact that this guy has a temper tantrum, and like so much shit results from it. That like, you know, everyone's kind of fucked in all of these different ways. And so it's like, sure, like wrath is motivating, but also it is destructive.
Yeah, and in the Thebaid, it's just that times 10. I like how you describe that. It's a guy having a temper tantrum.
Yeah.
In this, it's Polynices having the temper tantrum. It's his turn to be king, but Eteocles won't let him have his turn, so he's gonna destroy the city instead, and no one will get their turn, right? It's like toddlers.
Oh yeah. It's like toxic masculinity.
Oh yeah, that's basically it. So there's this is an interesting note for you. So when Titius is laying there dying, he's delivered this mortal blow by a Theban soldier named Melanippus. And Melanippus is lying there dying next to him. And Titius asks the Argive soldiers around him to bring the body to him so he can like start eating it. And all of the soldiers who help move Melanippus's body to be consumed by Titius have ancestors tainted by familial violence. So the soldiers that bring the body to him have Tantalus, Atreus, Lycaon, and Onomias as their ancestors. So it's funny how Atreus can be someone's ancestor, because he's kind of, if you think about it, he should be just existing in Mycenae at this time, because Atreus is the father of Agamemnon.
Yeah.
Titius is the father of Diomedes. So this is the generation before the fall of Troy. So it should be this like timeline, like a straight line, but it's just all over the place. So Atreus can be contemporary, but also an ancestor of one of these guys. So it's kind of interesting that way.
Yeah, that is super interesting. That's like, I mean, that's one of my favorite things, of like the ways that things just don't match up. Chronology is not a thing.
No, and like it's a nice way to think of even the ancient poets themselves. They're like, I don't know, I'm just gonna make Atreus be super old so it'll prove my own point. So he's like a grad student in that way. Now, in this moment of his death, Titius kind of becomes the Sphinx because he's devouring the Thebans. So he fully transgresses that boundary between a hero and into a monster. It's weird that I'm so excited about him, but I used to really like the show Hannibal, so maybe that's why I like Titius so much. He's just a really interesting guy.
I mean, I love the absolute weirdest people in Greek mythology. Like, I mean, I love that there's cannibalism, because, I mean, again, this is Roman, but like Roman about Greek mythology, which is interesting in itself.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, like cannibalism is very rare, but it is also Tantalus, you know, like it is like Tantalus is the most famous, and then Thyestes too, especially if we're talking, if like Atreus and Thyestes are ancestors when they should be contemporaries.
Mm-hmm.
Like those are your two most famous acts of cannibalism that result in crazy curses.
Yeah, and I guess the same argument can be applied to the House of Atreus, that by having this cannibalism connection, it's this sort of microcosm of their self-destructive family. So instead of creating new life, they're destroying it, and they're literally consuming it, so they're not being able to procreate, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's a really interesting way to use cannibalism. So it's symbolic, but also in this particular Roman epic, it's there for the shock factor as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's yeah. I love that phrasing though. Again, you got some good like gross and well said things.
I know it is really gross, and that one scholar I mentioned before, Kyle Gervais, who was one of my professors, he has an article out comparing Statius, who's the author of this epic, to Quentin Tarantino. So he's basically the Tarantino of ancient Rome. There's
Oh
a lot
yeah.
of blood, there's a lot of gore. People are like, it's entertaining, but it's a little bit too much, right? And that's kind of how this poetry from the historical period that produced this poem is viewed as this poetry of excess. And it's not, and for hundreds of years, it was viewed as not being very good poetry and inferior to the poetry that became before it. But I thought we could talk some more about that because that was all I was going to discuss about the Thebaid itself, unless you had some questions about it.
I mean, it's so hard because of course I decided we wanted to record this so that we just wanted to talk about it, and I'm like, I still haven't read this, so but I know the story, so it's interesting because I know the story that it's based on. You know, like I've covered what's the Euripides I did, the Phoenician women.
Oh,
I
yeah.
covered it under that version, so I find that interesting just because it focuses more on Jocasta. And it's yeah, because it's like it's such a famous story, the Seven Against Thebes, like it's all of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then this Roman take that makes it more violent and more visceral and adds cannibalism and curses and stuff is just so much more interesting. And so I'm just more like now I'm really excited to read it.
Yeah, it's like Ovid. Like, I know
I do.
you prefer ancient Greek sources, but you also love Ovid because
But
Ovid is so,
Ovid.
yeah, he has this way of describing those myths in a way that really appeals to modern readers, right? There's that, there's the pathos, so there's all this emotion, and there's betrayals and love and lust and everything. So the Roman writers are really good at adding the emotion to stories that sometimes the Greeks don't quite have there.
Yeah, I think I always describe it as like, and this is just my own theory, but I think of it as because the Greeks, these were their ancestral stories versus the Romans were like commenting on existing stories. The Romans didn't have the same connection historically to the stories, and so they had this like different viewpoint on them. It's almost like they were more fictionalizing them. Like they were the Hollywood making movies off of Shakespeare or something, you know? So it like they had this huge disconnect in terms of time and culture. So they have this really different and much more dramatic and like cinematic take on these existing stories.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it because they're so far removed from the history and the culture of ancient Greece. So, in classical Greece, the Greeks were kind of driven by sophrosune, so like this idea that everything should be in order, everything should be like be moderated, so you don't have this excess of emotion, and it just kind of draws into philosophy as well of how to be a good person, is you don't have these excess of emotion. Whereas the Romans, they love their excess. They're like, let's go for it. Let's make it as gory as we can.
Yeah, just like hugely different people and time periods. And I think so often, unless you're like deep in the world of the ancient Mediterranean, like you often see them as much more contemporary than they were, at least when you're talking about the stories that we talk about. Like,
Mhm.
obviously, a lot of their cultures were contemporary and existed alongside each other. But like, if we're talking about the Iliad versus, you know, Ovid or versus this guy versus the Thebaid, like, we've got there's such a huge amount of time in between that you
Mhm.
often forget just how many hundreds of years is in between these two periods, and so why they are so different, and like just how different they were as people and their stories and their like the reasons they did things, the reasons they told stories, all these different things are just so different because there is so much time in between.
Exactly. And I know I mentioned Ovid a lot, but there's a lot of time in between Ovid and Statius himself too. So there's this
Right, I meant to ask when he's from. Yeah,
yeah, okay, so I can give you some historical context. So I'm excited about
please.
this. So you can't talk about Rome, the Thebaid, without talking about ancient Rome. So, like I mentioned before, the Thebaid is an epic poem, and it's written in the Silver Age of Latin poetry. And to explain what that is, I have to talk about Augustus. I know you don't really like him, but we're going to talk about him a little bit. So, after a series of terrible civil wars, Augustus becomes the first emperor of Rome, and he establishes this first imperial family, the Julio-Claudians. And the importance of the imperial family, most notably the emperor himself, is established through a system of images and symbols in official art. The beginning of Augustus's rule is called the Golden Age, and poets of the Golden Age include Horace and Virgil, and they are writing to glorify the peace and prosperity that was brought by Augustus's reign. So the Golden Age was a period of political and cultural stability and harmony, whereas the Silver Age was marked by the descent into oppressive autocracy. So Ovid is writing between the transition between the Golden and the Silver Age. So you have this peace and prosperity brought by Augustus at the beginning of his reign. And then he gets a little too used to power. He starts making these rules. And Ovid, we don't know what he did, but he got exiled. So he's one of the first of those silver poets that kind of suffers for their poetry. And this poetry of the Silver Age is characterized by either a literature of escapism or protest. The Thebaid is written much later than Augustus and Ovid, which was the Julio-Claudian period. It was written under the reign of Domitian, who was the last of the Flavian emperors, and notably the worst of them. So here we see this link of a literature of escapism or possibly protest under the rule of a supposedly oppressive emperor. The link between emperors and poets is a really important one because epic poetry is a really difficult and time-consuming form of art. In the class where we read the Thebaid, our professor, he had us try to write our own verse compositions. So we were writing dactylic hexameter in Latin. It took us 3 months to do 5 lines, Liv. Can you imagine doing 12 books of this? So you need to have the time and the resources to sit down and do it, right? So the emperor is there to help facilitate the poetry, to make sure it gets written. But in return, your poetry has to serve to elevate the empire and the emperor in some way in return for that support. In the Augustan age, there was sort of go-betweens the emperor and the poet, and there were guys named Messala and Maecenas who patronized the poets like Horace and Virgil. I don't remember who Statius's patron was per se, but his poetry is inextricably linked to Domitian. He actually mentions Domitian in the poem. And for a very long time, the Thebaid was considered like not a good poem because of this connection to Domitian. And it's really interesting to see how that connection changed and evolved over time. Because in Statius's own time, he was really popular. He's mentioned by name by Juvenal. And even after he's dead, in the medieval period and even in the Renaissance, he's still popular. He influenced a lot of the allegorical writings by medieval writers, and he was a big influence for Dante's Inferno. But around the 18th century, this view on Statius kind of changes. Statius is seen as a poet that's not a very good one, and his poem is just full of blood and violence and nothing else. And it's interesting to note that there's this decline in his popularity in the 18th century, and instead we've got this rise in popularity of Virgil in the 18th century, where we're also seeing the rise of the nation state. So we know Virgil was writing under Augustus, and his poetry kind of includes Augustan ideals of empire making. So we can see why the 18th century people would be more of a fan of Virgil when they're trying to colonize the world, right? And it's not until...
I was just going to yell the word colonialism.
Yeah. That's basically it. And it's not until the 1980s where we see this rise in Statius again. So that's hundreds of years later. And this is also connected to the decline in the view of Virgil, because there was a lot of scholarship being done in the 1980s where readings of Roman history and Augustus are connected to 20th century dictators. So there's this one scholar named Ronald Syme who kind of connects Augustus with Hitler a little bit, and like Goebbels, in how he used this propaganda. So I'm not saying here that Virgil's like Hitler, but there was this sort of rise in scholarship at that time connecting emperors to dictators. So going off that, if you're a Roman poet and you have to connect your poetry to the emperor and the empire in some way, what do you do when the emperor you're connected to is a bad one? Like, can you outright say he's bad, or do you have to be really clever with how you're writing? So that's an interesting way of reading the Thebaid, because if we look at the themes of self-destruction and the themes of familial violence, and we're looking at the Julio-Claudians and the Flavians, which are ultimately failed dynasties, right? So are they being punished? Are their dynasties ending because of the crimes of the people that came before? I don't know. Is that what Statius is saying? That's something someone could write a paper about.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like, you're writing this story, like, yes, it's Greece, it's Greek mythology. Oh, it just happened to be these guys who, like, oh, do you think they resemble the dynasties that came before? I don't know. Oh, it must be a coincidence. Like.
There's an element of the Thebaid that you're really gonna hate, because in it we get the figure of Theseus. So Theseus kind of comes in to like save the day. So you know how in Antigone, after the war between Eteocles and Polynices, Creon is the king of Thebes, and Creon goes a little bit power mad. Well, in the end of the Thebaid, Creon and Theseus have this like single combat moment where Theseus and Athens kind of prevail over the violence of Thebes. So, and Statius makes all these connections between Theseus and Domitian. But even the ancients themselves know that Theseus isn't quite a good guy. So what do you think Domitian would have thought of this connection between him and Theseus? So that's another thing someone could write a paper about. I'd like to read that.
Well, and Theseus, though, yeah, Theseus is so interesting because, like, he is, like, objectively shitty, but depending on how you wanted to see him, like, you could see him as this, like, objectively really shitty dude, or you can see him as the guy who founded Athenian, or laid the foundations for Athenian democracy. Like, he also can very much be seen as like kind of an Aeneas figure almost, where it's like he started the thing that would go on to be the great thing that they, want to believe. So, like, I can see, he does all this shit, but like he really is so often used in really similar propaganda style ways. Like, even this feels like Athenian propaganda because, like, hello, like, Theseus is a much later invention than the mythological characters that actually take part in this war. Theseus, it's like Theseus is not. He's very much post, Iliad and Odyssey. And so I love when anyone tries to like stick him in these weird places he doesn't belong. The way that he gets just put into these different things, though, because there are a lot of cases where he's like kind of tucked in later as if like he played this important role in something where you're like, nah, like he was a later invention to make Athens feel good about themselves.
Mm-hmm. I like the way you compared him to Aeneas, because Aeneas and the Aeneid is really important for the Thebaid, because a lot of the Thebaid looks back to the example set by Virgil's Aeneid, but instead of just using the template that Virgil set, Statius is inverting the message of the Aeneid. So there's some particular examples in there, like women in the Aeneid. They're considered to be a bad thing because they're delaying the hero from achieving his goal. But in the Thebaid,
that Dido, real troublemaker.
in the Thebaid, women also like act to delay the hero from achieving their goal, but it's a good thing because the goal of the heroes is to take on Thebes, and we all know that this is the reason they're all going to die and that Thebes is going to be destroyed. So women in the epic are actually really good characters because they're trying to stop this destruction, which is really interesting that he would take that template set by Virgil and kind of turn it on its head.
Yeah, like, oh, ladies aren't so bad. Not all the time, at least.
I should have talked about it more, but maybe you can find another scholar who studies the Thebaid to talk about the presentation of women. Polynices' wife Argia is really interesting, and there's this whole situation where they meet the women of Lemnos, and Hypsipyle is an important character in the middle of the Thebaid as well. So that's something.
Really?
Yeah. It's, I guess, like, again, with that connection with the Aeneid, Aeneas is kind of prevented from founding Rome by that kind of pit stop in Carthage. So the seven are kind of delayed from their journey to Thebes by going to Lemnos, and they kind of get caught up in what's going on there, and they're trying to sort of help Hypsipyle in some way.
I love that because I want Hypsipyle to be in it, but also that is the biggest pit stop. Like, that is so far away. Like,
I know!
Between Argos and Thebes, they are very close to each other. Like, they're like, I'm like showing this on the screen. Nobody's going to see this in the episode. They are very close to each other. And then Lemnos is like out on the other side of the sea. Why would... That's great. That's an amazing thing because it doesn't make any sense, and I love that. Like, why? Okay.
I think in the Thebaid, Bacchus or Dionysus, he also wants to delay the inevitable destruction of Thebes because Thebes is his special place, right? So he kind of diverts them on their way there. So he's kind of acting like the Juno figure in the Aeneid. Yeah,
I love this. This is so great. I can't wait to read this.
It's really like it's crazy,
oh my gosh,
but it's fun.
That's so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I bet. Oh my god. Yeah, I'm so in on this. This is like, oh, what a weird diversion. And Hypsipyle of all people, like they're throwing in yet another timeline where you're like, does this fully check out? Like, that's so interesting.
Yeah, trying to make a chronological map of Greek mythology is just impossible, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. I love when people try to ask me questions about that, and I've sort of a standard line now of like, just don't trouble yourselves. It's gonna make your head hurt, and you're not gonna get anywhere.
Yeah, I think like mythological Greece is its time in its own self, so you can't really impose chronology on it at all.
No, not when you've got like 500 years of people adding to stories and changing things and making their own versions. Like, it just, that's why everything changes.
Mm-hmm. All right, I think that's all I have in my notes. So
So is there... I mean, now I'm just so in on it. I'm just like, this is so interesting. I can't wait to read it. Of course, by the time this comes out, I'll have already presented it to the listeners in some way. But now I'm just like super keen. I just think Thebes is... I mean, I know I love it because of Cadmus, but there's like so little you can actually read about Cadmus and Harmonia, in their actual like the time that they actually thrived in Thebes, and everything else related to the city tends to be about like the aftermath, their children, the curses, Oedipus, the mess he made, like all these different things. But the city itself is just so interesting, and I just, I constantly want to know more about it. And now I'm so excited for this epic. So thank you.
You're welcome. Did you want to talk more about Thebes? Because I had this whole alternate script of talking about presentation of Thebes in Greek mythology and going all the way down to Rome. And I was like, no, that's going to be too long. Don't do it. So I cut it all out. But I can talk about it if you want to.
I mean, are there any like really notable things that like, what is the deal there? I mean, I would love to hear more.
like, going off of what you just said, like, you can't find a lot of information about Cadmus in that royal family of his. And it's kind of like Oedipus supplanted Cadmus in myth, because Oedipus actually was more of a legendary character. When you first see Oedipus mentioned, I think, in Hesiod's work in Days, and he's involved in a war over the loss of his sheep. So somehow between then and
Really?
yeah, so he kind of evolves over time from this like folklore and legendary hero, and he becomes part of the royal family of Thebes, and then all these stories come up around him, and a lot of the stories are connected to like prophecies. And when you look at the earlier versions, the incest isn't there. It's just the prophecy about him killing his father. And like that's a whole other episode we could do, because I know a lot about weird prophecies as well. But it's just so interesting that Oedipus as a character kind of just came in and took over mythology of Thebes.
Yeah, that's the perfect way of putting it, because he really becomes like the guy when you're thinking about Thebes and talking about it in any way. And like his story is not ideal. So then you get this whole idea of Thebes being this less than ideal place. And like obviously it's also majorly influenced by Sophocles' version specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, like Sophocles is obviously Athenian, so it is like, while not outright propaganda, like it is an Athenian who is against Thebes writing about Thebes. So you have this like inherent kind of bias happening. And so we have so little that's like about Thebes by Thebans, or like about the good people of Thebes. Like ultimately Cadmus seems like, from the little that we know, to be like this really like generally good character. His worst flaw is that he gives up looking for his sister, which yes, is not ideal. But I always think like, if he knows that Zeus took her, he's kind of fucked trying to get her back. And he just is kind of accepted that hopefully she has a good life with Zeus. Not good, but as far as like ancient Greek mythological men, it's by far not the worst.
That's true.
And so it's like, he's just so interesting. And I just wish there was more all the time, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Athenian connection. There's a lot of scholarship about how Thebes kind of serves as the anti-Athens, where Athenians can discuss issues in Athens, but sort of like in a safe place, because Thebes mythologically is destroyed, right? So if we put in some problems Athens are facing, but transplant it to Thebes, it's not going to be a problem because we've set it in Thebes and not Athens.
Yeah, because I mean, like obviously you have the Oedipus of it all, and then Bacchae too, and like not just Oedipus, but everything that comes after, between Seven Against Thebes, and then all the other plays that retell that story as well. And yeah, you get to have all this commentary about life and decisions and rulership and kings versus not kings, all these different bits of commentary that you can do without setting it in Athens and getting yourself into trouble. I always find that so interesting.
And Statius is doing that, but like instead of talking about Rome, it's safe because we're talking about Thebes, but there's some connection to some problems in Rome as well.
Yeah.
So Thebes is just this playing field to discuss your problems without actually really addressing them.
Yeah, poor Thebes. Like, poor Thebes. That it feels like they deserve better. Well, no, they definitely deserve better.
Yeah.
So in the like sorry, now my brain lost it. Was there more to say though about like the way that it does kind of like evolve into this kind of different, I don't know, thing? Basically, please feel free to keep sharing things, but my brain is bad.
Like how it evolved from Oedipus, like how Oedipus
evolved? Or like into this Statius version, like this, you know, ancient, like I guess what you'd started saying about Hesiod, and I just wasn't sure if I cut you off and just started rambling about Cadmus. The difference of Oedipus and Works and Days to the, you know, Statius's version of Thebes.
Right. So we also see, like, first we see Oedipus in the Works and Days. We also see him, well, he's not actually a character, but he's sort of mentioned in the Underworld episode in the Odyssey. There's a lot of discussion of Theban women, and they talk about Epicasta, that's what they call Jocasta in Homer. And they describe how once she finds out about the incest between her and her son, like it's immediately known to her. It doesn't come by later, so they don't have any children. So in the version that we see in Homer, any children that he has to go on and like fight in Thebes aren't actually with the Epicasta figure. So it's just really interesting to see how, depending on what source you're looking at, there's these really subtle differences. In Statius, for example, Jocasta's alive. She's in the castle, like not the castle, the palace, the Cadmea, and she's talking to her kids, and she's trying to get her sons to stop fighting. And then you've got Oedipus kind of living in the basement like Bruno in Encanto. So he's kind of that guy who's there and nobody wants him around. So it's just an interesting family dynamic that all these bad things happen, but they're not dead and they're kind of still living with each other and uncomfortable with each other.
That's interesting because that's the same as in Euripides. In
Yeah.
Phoenician Women, like Oedipus is there, but he's just kind of like tucked away, being hidden, and Jocasta's there, like being strong and cool and interesting.
Jocasta's great. I love her.
I know, exactly. That's why I was like, if I'm ever going to tell the story of this war, like it's going to be Oedipus's version where she's alive and well and doing cool stuff. So I feel like she does end up killing herself in it, though. But at least she lasts longer than in Sophocles.
I've actually, I mentioned that I was writing about Thebes, and I've written a young adult version of this, but it's told from Oedipus's daughter's point of view. So instead of Antigone, it's Ismene. So it's like, she goes across Greece and she learns about all these cursed families and tries to discover what the curse on her family is, and tries to use that to stop the war between her brothers. So that's what I was working on.
I love that.
Yeah, I'm querying agents right now.
That's great. Have you read oh good.
So
I mean, now is the time, as I know well, because I've not finished mine. Yeah. Have you read The Children of Jocasta?
I have. I actually had a existential crisis about it because I had written the first draft of the book, and then I learned that Natalie Haynes had actually written the story I wanted to first, and I was like, well, what's the point? If Natalie Haynes did it, it'll be better. But I really like hers. It's really contained into like the Cadmea and Thebes itself, whereas my version's got a more broader scale. But Natalie Haynes is just great at everything she does.
I know. I feel the same way about so many things. Every time I read a new mythological retelling, I'm like, fuck, they're doing it first. But yours sounds very different, so I wouldn't ever worry about that. And also YA, I think, is good. There's not a ton of mythological YA, but like YA is such a field for getting published.
That's what I thought. Like, oh, there's not a lot of YA, so maybe more people will jump on it. We'll see, Liv. Like, we'll see how many people are excited to read it.
I've been there. I know that feeling very well. So I wish you so much luck with it.
Thank
you.
My
gosh. I mean, yeah, no, I've been through it. My first version was YA. My book has gone through like 18 different versions. It's so stupid how many times I've tried to write this story.
I know exactly how you feel. I had some agents were like, I like this, but I think you should change it and make it grittier and darker. And I was like, I have a grittier and darker version. I don't know which one to go with. So it really depends on who's reading it, right?
I know. I like the idea of grittier and darker. That's kind of, I'm not necessarily trying to make mine darker so much as I'm trying to make it like, I think I just have really lofty goals now. Like I now want it to like encompass so many different things. I've become obsessed with Samothrace. So now I'm like, well, now we have to have this whole bit on Samothrace before they get to Thebes. Yeah.
So is it like following Cadmus's journey?
Some versions of Harmonia are from.
Is it following Cadmus?
So it's like less about Cadmus. Yeah, like a little bit. Sorry, our delay is so bad with trying to this bit of it. But yeah, so like basically, because there's this version where Harmonia is the daughter of Electra, who's the queen of Samothrace, and then Cadmus like goes there. That's mostly in Nonus's Dionysiaca, which is like that wild ass epic. And so I've basically done like a lot from that epic and then kind of blended it all. So like she's not the daughter of Electra, but Electra's like her adoptive mother, and basically she was like put to be cared by Electra, but she is the child of Aphrodite and Ares still. And then so I'm now kind of so obsessed with the island of Samothrace and the Samothracian mysteries that I'm gonna set probably one whole book on Samothrace.
Wow.
And I'm going to Samothrace at the end of June, and I'm gonna spend 2 weeks there, and I'm gonna fucking finish it. And so yeah, and then so like Cadmus will come, and like he will have like, I'll subtly, like it's more about Harmonia, but I'm touching upon his story searching for Europa and then ending up on Samothrace. Like just in smaller bits, like different perspectives, and then they'll like eventually, once I'm finished dealing with all my Samothracian mystery obsession, then they'll go to Thebes, and then I have to write a whole thing on Thebes too. But meanwhile, like all the other versions of my book did not even include Samothrace. It was just all about Thebes. And I actually, like the very first versions, well, most of the original versions were involved like actually, like for lack of a more nuanced word, time travel. And I had, which was like, I literally like that original story, and it was like modern people and like connecting back to ancient Cadmus and Harmonia and like this whole thing. And I actually really loved it, but it just turned out to be not the book I wanted to write once I had the platform that I do.
Mm-hmm.
Like I just wanted to be more like ancient, and then also I think it is more appealing to the audiences right now. And then of course now I'm obsessed with Samothrace.
Yeah,
and
like
I just need to write out Samothrace all the time.
I can see it in my head, like Harmonia, like Circe or Ariadne. So like, this sounds really great.
I'm working on it. Yeah, I want it to be like, I don't know. I'm not very, my biggest issue because of the podcast is that I'm really good at storytelling, but I'm not really good at like character development, because I don't develop characters. I read myths. And so I really, that's why it's never done, because I really struggle with like the part of writing a novel that is like the most important, which is like the fiction, the inventing, the like the creation of these people. But meanwhile I'm like, but the myths. So that's, yeah, that's like my biggest hurdle, which is why I'm literally just going to spend 2 weeks on Samothrace just writing, because there's like nothing on Samothrace except for pretty scenery and the sanctuary of the mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and it's so little and weird and cheap to be there because it's not a big touristy island.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm excited.
Well, it'll add a lot of richness and depth to your descriptions of it, so it's gonna be amazing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'll be like away from my house and I'll be able to write it, because otherwise I'm just like always working on the podcast and I never do any creative writing. It's so bad. And oh my gosh. Well, this has devolved. I love talking books, so thank you.
You're welcome. Do you have
I'm excited for yours though. That's a great idea.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
Do you have like beta readers that like are familiar with Greek myth and also like writing commercial literature? Or are you just kind of like, I can't show this to anybody because I'm afraid they'll steal my ideas kind of thing?
I'm a little bit of that, because Harmonia and Cadmus are so untouched.
Yeah.
So untouched. Like, and I love that. And I have had them in my head since 2008.
Wow.
When I started writing the first versions of this. Yes. So I'm like deeply protective over them as characters. My agent, because I have an agent through the podcast, and I thank the gods ended up finding this podcast agent who works for a literary agency.
Oh, great.
So in getting an agent for my podcast, I got a literary agent by default, which was very exciting for me, because my books I don't think are good enough yet for an agent, but my podcast is, so it worked out. Yeah, so my agents read like a version, but I got so obsessed with the mysteries and Samothrace that I wrote like a 70,000 word novel where like nothing happened, because I was so obsessed with the myth. So now I have to like rewrite it and make it into a thing where it has like all the structure of a novel. Like, what a concept. And I have to, you know, all those different things that I struggle with because I'm used to just telling myths. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really the only person who's read it. Yeah.
Well, if you're
How
ever...
about you? Have you worked with people on yours?
I have.
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
no,
please
that's
also
okay.
offer, because I didn't want to ask.
No, I was gonna say, if you wanted like a beta reader / critique partner, like I'd be happy to bounce your ideas off of. Because you're right, it's so hard to write mythology, but in a way that's fun to read about. Because my first draft was just people telling each other myths, and it's like, this is not interesting, Meagan. This is just
Right?
him talking about Cadmus sewing the teeth. Like, there's nothing happening here. Get back to the war, please. So it's hard to kind of marry the myth and then a plot together. One of the things that helped me was like reading things outside of myth retelling. So like if you found something that had really good pacing, just kind of read that and look at the ways they do that to kind of move the plot of your own story along. But if you ever wanted to like send a chapter you're not sure of, I could try to help you out. I'd be happy to do that. And our stories are different enough that like we're not gonna steal from each other kind of thing.
No, yeah, I wouldn't worry.
Yeah.
And also like I think we're clearly on the same page of yours just generations lower than mine. It's perfect.
Yeah. I mentioned Cadmus as this distant guy. He's not actually there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason the palace is called the Cadmia. You got to mention him. Love some help on it, because I also just overthink it. Like my ADHD manifests in that way where like I'm so busy perfecting one chapter that I never like write the whole fucking book. And it's like, it's just a constant. I'm just like, I'm probably not meant to be a novel writer. Like, I think that's pretty certain, but I also refuse to let go of these characters. So I just keep going. But yeah, I'm more than happy to do that. I'm also happy to just like talk Thebes anytime. So
all right. Well, I would probably hold you to that.
I love how much this has evolved. I love just chatting about classics, everything. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to it now. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. I had so much fun talking about it with you.
Oh, I'm so glad. I fucking love Thebes and everything about it. Is there anything that you want my listeners to know about you, to promote, anywhere they can follow you? If you have no answers, that's also fine.
Yeah, well, I am on Twitter at Meagan Cleveland, but instead of a D at the end, it's an 8 for some reason. So you can follow me on Twitter. Or my Instagram is Little Red Reading, where it's more of like a bookstagram, if anything else. So if you like classics inspired books, we could always talk about that.
I love that handle. That's such a wonderful Instagram handle. Well done.
Thanks.
That's great. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I hope everyone follows you on that, because that's so fun. And thanks again so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. It's been so much fun. I love talking nerdery stuff. So thank you.
Nerds, as always, thank you so much for listening. Another huge thank you to Meagan Cleveland, who studied the absolute hell out of this epic, and for coming on and sharing so many interesting things about it, and frankly convincing me that even though it's Roman, it's still worth my time. We had so much fun, and that in itself is a real feat, unless you're Seneca, I guess. Make sure you follow Meagan on Twitter and Instagram, Little Red Reading. What a great handle. And I know you all love mythological retellings in all shapes and forms. This episode was so much fun. I am always here to learn more about Thebes. Why is it so cool? It's just so interesting. Underrated. Thank you to Meagan. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians. Perhaps more commonly known as the assistant producer. The podcast is hosted and monetized by iHeartMedia. Listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Help me continue bringing you the world of Greek mythology and the ancient Mediterranean by becoming a patron, where you'll get bonus episodes and more. Visit patreon.com/mythsbaby or click the link in this episode's description. I am Liv, and I seriously love Thebes and every expert willing to talk about it, even if it's about a Roman epic. That's really saying something.